Essex is a lot rougher than what people believe. I mean, they all think it's a quiet little villagey type thing when actually it's not. It's total opposite. It's an ideal place for crime and drugs because there's so many people in such a small area. All round, I mean, it's nothing like what people expect.
I heard on the grapevine that Pat Tate had been released from prison and that someone had shot him. So remembering what a great bloke he was, I rang Mick Steele to see if I could get a number for him. I finally got through to Pat on his mobile. He'd taken it with him into hospital and he seemed really pleased to hear from me. I arranged to go and visit him the next day, taking 4 bottles of lager as a kind of well done for not being dead present. Just before I left, I happened to mention it to a friend who also knew Pat, but not too well, that I was going to see him. He told me to say hello, and remembering Pat's obsession with building his body, I asked if I could find out if he had any steroids for sale. I was really looking forward to seeing Pat again, but within about 30 seconds of getting to the hospital, I realised that he just wasn't the bloke I used to know. He was really arrogant, noisy, and right off his face on something or other. There was this young girl there, couldn't have been more than 16, and right in front of her he started saying to me, "Here Darren, this is Lisa. She's just here to give me a blowjob, so I don't have to bother my girlfriend when she comes to visit me. Do you want one? She doesn't mind, she does it for a living. She's fucking good at it." Then he started ordering her about, sending her off to get cups of tea and that, treating her like she was a bit of dirt or something. I'd heard he was running a load of young prostitutes down in Southend, and I guess they'd brought one along. Once she was away, he started going on about how he was going to set up Nipper Ellis and kill him, and how people were smuggling drugs into the hospital so he didn't have to go without. It's like a fucking party in here every night. You should come by again later. My mate Tony will be here. I'd fucking love the two of you to meet. When I mentioned the mutual friend who wanted the steroids, Pat suddenly got really excited. How much does he need? You tell him as much as he wants, I can get them for him. I can get fucking truckloads. Does he just want steroids? I can get the lot. Ease, Whiz, Charlie, Puff. Tell him no matter how much he needs, I can get it. I'm the man. Maybe it was the drugs he'd taken. Maybe it's because I hadn't seen him in such a long time that I'd forgotten what he was really like. Or maybe getting shot in the arm had affected his brain. Either way, the bloke in the hospital wasn't the Pat Tate I remembered. He'd gone from nice bloke to total wanker. Later that day, Mick rang me up and asked me to go over to his bungalow in Angers Green, as he had some work for me. I'd spoken to Mick a couple of times since I'd been released, bumped into him once, but this was the first time I'd had a chance to catch up properly. We were standing in his kitchen, and he'd asked if I'd seen Pat and what I thought of him. "Listen Mick," I said, "no offence, right, because I know the guy's your friend and all that, but I really didn't like him. He wasn't the same Pat I met at Hollandsey Bay. He seems to have turned into a bit of an arsehole." Mick just laughed, then asked if I'd mind going over to his mum's house in Point Clear to have a look at her central heating, which was playing up. Once we got there, it was obvious the whole thing needed to be replaced, and Mick paid me to do the work. We spent a lot of time chatting over the next few days, and in some stupid way, it was a bit like being back inside. I felt like we were becoming mates all over again. I was seeing quite a bit of Mick now, and would often drop in on him if I was in the area. About a week after Pat had gone back to prison, Mick called me up and asked me to go round to see him. I found him at Tate's house, where he was building a low wall and laying a driveway in the front, just as a favour to his friend. Mick said he had something to show me, and we both went to sit in the front of his car. He then pulled a bar of cannabis resin out from my bag and asked whether I thought I could sell it for him. Now, believe it or not, I'd never touched cannabis in my life. My wife smoked it all the time, but I'd never even tried it. I was always more of a drinker than anything else. I told Mick that I really didn't think I could do anything, but he told me to take it away and see how I got on. If I had no luck, I could just give it back to him. If I did sell it, however, it was down to me to fix the price. Mick wanted £600 for the bar. Anything else I made was mine to keep. As I was leaving, Mick explained that Pat Tate had been working on some drug importations and now he'd gone back inside. He'd asked Mick to look after them. If I did manage to sell the stuff, there was plenty more available. I went back to Braintree, made a couple of calls and a couple of appointments, and that was it. I'd become a drug dealer. Not only that, I seemed to be pretty good at it. It turned out that virtually everyone I knew either smoked dope or knew someone who wanted some. Once I'd put the word around, people started coming out of the woodwork all over the place. I'd let them try a little bit, and once they realised it was good stuff, they would all buy some. I sold the lot within a couple of hours and made around £200 profit. Any doubts or dilemmas I had about getting involved in the drug trade vanished the moment I felt the money in my hand. I took Mick at his word so far as the supplies were concerned and went to see him the next day. And the next. And the next. I'd been hinting to Mick that I wanted some kind of active role once he was back in the drug smuggling business. Selling the stuff had shown me how easy it was to make money at the end. I knew the profits from smuggling were going to be much higher. Mick seemed to be doing really well out of it, and I wanted some of what he had. I told him I wasn't interested in doing anything too heavy, just something to earn some extra money. Prison certainly didn't scare me anymore, so I felt like I had nothing to lose. But Mick had some doubts. He was worried about the fact that I'd never been abroad before. I'd only got a passport for the first time in my life about a month earlier, and I planned to use it on one of them cheap day trips to France, but I hadn't got round to it yet. Mick had pretty much decided he was going to at least start off with his usual team, but then fate lent me a helping hand. A guy called Paul Gwinnett was under arrest for breaching a warrant banning him from entering Belgium. He'd been caught out by a routine customs check as he was getting off the boat, and they discovered he was the subject of a 10-year ban. It all meant that the gang was one man short for the trip, so Mick called on me. My first job was to pick up Mick from his home in Anglers Green. I arrived in my battered old VW Golf, expecting to head straight out for the coast, but he gave me directions to a pub near Clacton. As we pulled up, I saw a bloke standing in the car park wave at Mick and make his way over. He was in his 40s, about 6 foot tall, with greying hair. He actually looked a bit like a slimmer version of Mick, sort of like a younger brother, but without any of the charisma. He sat in the back and was introduced to me as Peter, but he didn't say very much. I remembered that I had a bag with him, and he seemed really nervous, but that was about it. I remembered that Mick used to talk about a Peter Corey that he used to smuggle drugs with, so I assumed this must be the guy. But it didn't seem the time or place to start asking questions, so I just drove. As we made our way to Folkestone to catch the ferry, Mick told me he wanted me to go to Amsterdam with him to meet Dopey Harris, his main contact over there. Because with Gwinnett in prison, I'd been making the trips over there to complete the first stage in the smuggling process. All I had to do was pick up the drugs in Amsterdam, have negotiated a good price, then drive them over to Belgium. There was no border in between the two countries, so I didn't have to worry about being stopped, unless I did something really stupid, or unless I was just plain unlucky. Once in Belgium, Mick would meet me at the beach in his boat. I'd load the drugs in, and he'd set off back to England. After that, I'd be free to make my way back on the ferry, and even if I did get stopped and searched, there would be nothing to incriminate me. I have to admit it sounded like a pretty good plan, and the £2,000 a time he promised me for the work sounded even better. We got to Folkestone, and Mick pulled out a bundle of cash from his bag to cover the cost of the tickets. "How much you got in there anyway?" I said, as a joke really. Mick looked at me. 80 grand. He said it so casually, I tried not to sound like I'd never seen that much money before in my life. "Alright, drinks on you then." He had to fill in some personal details on the form for the ferry tickets. I went to put his name down, but he stopped me. "My name's too well known around the customs people. Just put your name down." We got a cabin on the boat and chatted about nothing in particular until we got bored of each other and got a bit of sleep. We finally got to Ostend in the early hours of the morning, and I drove all the way to Amsterdam along the coast road. By the time we pulled into the centre of the city and Mick told me where to park, I was absolutely knackered. We walked to Stones Calf, which is on the road that runs parallel to the dam rack and is nearly opposite a police station. When we arrived, Dopey Harris wasn't there, and we waited in the bar. Amsterdam is a weird place anyway, and all the coffee bars like Stones where you can legally buy and smoke small amounts of cannabis are weird as still. They're usually full of French and British students stoned out their brains, even at 9 in the morning. This place was just the same, with loads of people giggling and the air thick with that funny pong. But what made Stones different was that it was also full of groups of English blokes just like us. And in every group there would be one bloke holding a bag, just a bit too carefully. And slowly I realised that everyone was waiting for Dopey Harris, who got his name because of his business interests, not because he was thick, to go off and do a deal. Harris was a friend of the cafe owners and hung out there when he wasn't dealing, so we liked to meet all his contacts there. I don't think the owner had a clue what was going on. Harris invited us all to a flat close to the cafe. The place was full of masses of video equipment with loads of cameras trained on the door and stairway. Apart from that, the room was very basic, with one large table, one corner sofa, a couple of chairs and a ski machine for exercising. Apart from drug deals, it didn't look like much else went on there. Behind the smiles and the chirpy conversation, you could see that both Harris and Mick were being cautious, sizing each other up, wondering how much they could trust the other. But slowly, the tension eased, and they started to get more familiar with each other. We all sat around drinking coffee and chatting about drugs and exchange rates because everything there was bought in guilders. He also explained that he had no drugs to buy. I could not say when there might be some, as there was currently a shortage across the whole of Amsterdam. He simply didn't know whether it would be soon or not. Mick decided he couldn't take the money back with him to England, so he decided to leave it with Harris. I guess he trusted the guy completely by then. It was left that Harris would contact Mick, and then I would go over and do the deal with Harris to ensure the exchange rate was correct. After we'd finished talking proper business, the conversation dried up, so we decided to leave. I was still knackered from driving through the night, so Peter volunteered to take over the wheel. Rather than going back the way we came, Mick was really keen on the idea of coming back through the Channel Tunnel, so we headed off towards Calais. I was well up for it, and neither Mick or Peter had been through the tunnel before, so it was something we were all looking forward to. I went to the duty-free shop at the terminal and bought some perfume for the wife, and a case of lager for myself, while Peter and Mick stocked up on cigarettes. When we finally got on the train, I was still really tired, so I decided to have a quick nap before we set off. Mick woke me up at Dover. I'd missed the whole thing. I always believed that bad things happen in threes, so that was number one. As we drove back from Dover to the Dartford Tunnel, it became very clear what number two would be. The petrol gauge on the Golf was getting pretty close to empty. I suggested we stop off and fill up, but Mick was really keen to get home. He insisted that he'd worked out what mileage we'd done. There was still loads left, no matter what the gauge said. We hit the A12 to Ipswich and passed another petrol station. "Keep going," they said, "keep going." Then we passed the Brentwood garage. "Keep going," they said, "keep going." And we did, for at least a mile, until we ran out of petrol and ground to a halt. That's two, I thought to myself. It was pitch black and freezing cold as I walked along the A112 back to the Brentwood garage. I didn't have a petrol can in the car, so I had to buy one, fill it up and trudge back. I kept trying to cage a lift, but no one stopped, so I just kept on walking. Then my mobile went off. It was Mick. "We can see you," he said. "We're about half a mile away, but you're getting closer all the time." His voice sounded really strange. Then Mick burst into a massive laughing fit and put the phone down. About 10 minutes later he phoned again and did the same thing. "I've got my binoculars and I can see you coming towards us," he said, before collapsing in a fit of giggles again. I didn't find it funny at all. Couldn't work out why Mick was behaving in such a strange way. It was really out of character. It's not so much the guy didn't have a sense of humour, it's just that he was always so serious. It was only when I got back to the car that I found out why they were so happy. They'd got so bored of waiting around, they'd broken into my cases of lager and drunk the lot. That was free. I was pissed off in a major way, and really tempted to tell them to fuck off and to find their own way back. But I was also only too aware that in the next week or so, Mick was offering me the chance to earn £2,000 for 18 hours work, so I drove them home. I didn't get back myself until well after 10 that morning and had to go straight to bed. In less than 30 hours, I'd gone from having never been abroad in my life to having been on a ferry through 3 European countries and the Channel Tunnel. As far as I was concerned, I was a seasoned traveller. I'd actually really enjoyed it. A couple of days later, Mick rang to say the drugs were ready to be picked up. It was time to go abroad again. This time, I decided to take my Peugeot 405 because I thought it'd be a lot more comfortable. I drove over to Mick's and then followed him in his car to a pub where we'd met Peter Corey the first time round. The three of us then went to a cash point in Clacton where Mick took out £250, money to cover our expenses. Peter went for a piss, nerves probably, and Mick took the opportunity to take me to one side and explain that even though he'd given me the Marina radio to contact me when we got close to the coast, Peter was in charge. After all, Peter had made the same trip dozens of times and knew exactly what he was doing. If there was any problems, I should do exactly what Peter said. And if there weren't any problems, then I should do what Peter said anyway. Unfortunately, the only thing that Mick didn't tell me about Peter was that he was a total prat. As we drove down to Folkestone, he kept going on about what a big man he was, and how people across Clacton where he lived were really scared of him. It was like he was trying to do it to impress me for no reason. After all, I was just there to do a job of work, the same as him. But it was all, "If you're ever in Clacton, just mention my name and you'll be alright. It's my town. I virtually run the place." It was another overnight ferry, so we took a cabin, which gave Peter the chance to get on my nerves at right close up. He spent the whole journey saying things like, "If we get stopped by the police, tell them I'm a hitchhiker you've just picked up." Basically, his attitude was that if we got caught out, I should take the blame for everything, so we can go back and explain the situation to Mick. Peter was so anxious about being able to use the hitchhiker excuse that he refused to drive the whole time. Then, on the way to Amsterdam, the radiator sprung a leak, giving him another chance to panic. We couldn't find a garage anywhere, and we were running low on diesel as well. In the end, we parked up on a garage forecourt at about 5 in the morning, and got a couple of hours sleep while we waited for it to open. Having sorted out the radiator and filled it up, we finally got into Amsterdam proper at 10 AM and met Toby Harris. We agreed a price of $1,150 per kilo, which gave us just under 70 kilos of top quality cannabis resin. The drugs themselves weren't kept at the calf, so we had to wait for them to be brought to us. One of Harris's business partners pulled up outside the calf in a brand new Merc about 3 hours later with the drugs in his boot. Rather than just taking them there and then, I asked him to guide me to the main road out of the city, so I didn't end up driving around in circles for hours. Once I knew where I was, he pulled over and we swapped the drugs over from the boot of his car to mine, and then I set off towards Belgium. We only made one stop on the way, at a payphone to call Mick and let him know that we was on our way to Blankenberg. He had a 4-hour journey across the English Channel and wasn't particularly keen to leave unless he knew we definitely had the goods. I could hear the excitement in his voice as I told him everything was fine and that we'd meet up with him as planned. It was the first time he'd done any proper smuggling since he'd been sent to prison back in 1990. As far as he was concerned, the good old days were back again. We made really good time and got to Blankenberg about 3 hours early. The area had been chosen because it had a perfect ready-made smuggling spot that Mick had taken advantage of many times in the past. If you stand on the pier and look out to sea, on your left is a beautiful 10-mile-long sandy beach. On your right, there are 3 or 4 really ugly grey concrete pipes, which take sewage or something into the sea. The pipes stick out of the water a good few feet, and Mick was planning to bring the boat up to the second pipe on the right. That way, it'd be hidden from the beach and the pier. Up until now, I've been podding up with Peter, mostly by ignoring him, just going off into my own little world. But once we'd gotten into Blankenberg, he became completely impossible to deal with. I said we should just go to the main car park by the beach, like every other person in the area was doing, wait till it got dark, and near the rendezvous time, take the drugs from the boat and head from the water. But he wanted to treat the whole thing like some big military operation. Park miles away, walk to the beach to check the coast was clear, then walk back for the drugs. But the problem was with that, we'd parked so far away, we had no idea if the coast would still be clear by the time we got the drugs. It was stupid, but that's the way we did it, because Peter was in charge. One long walk later, Peter decided it was time to drive close to the beach and take the drugs out. He changed into his waterproofs. He'd be going back in the boat with Mick, and we took the drugs and hid ourselves in some grassy sand dunes about 200 yards from the waterline. We were sitting there in the dark with these 3 sports bags stuffed full of cannabis, and people were walking right by us, either taking the dogs out for a walk or going for a cold swim. None of them seemed to be paying us much attention though. We had the Marina Band walkie-talkie turned to channel 14. The idea was to wait until the allotted time and then switch it on. Once we confirmed Mick was there, we'd flash a torch to give him a bearing. He was navigating in the dark using this miniature satellite link, but it was only accurate to within about 20 metres, so we still needed guidance for the final approach. There were a couple of minutes to go, and Peter turned on the radio. All we got was some fishermen muttering in French. That sent the big man from Clacton off into a right panic. I was trying to explain that it probably just meant that Mick was still a little far out. Once he got nearer, he'd override the other signal. He'd stressed that we should always wait for him to call rather than give the game away. Until there were drugs in his boat, he'd always be able to bluff his way out of trouble by saying he was fishing or something, so if anything went wrong, it was important there was no link between the 3 of us. Otherwise, we'd all get done for smuggling. So we waited, and waited, and waited. When it got to 15 minutes past the meeting time, Peter was practically having kittens. "I tell you what we're going to do," he said. "We're going to take the bags and we're going to move down the beach." I couldn't believe it. "No way," I told him. "No way am I moving from this well-hidden bit of grass to sit on a beach like a fucking idiot with 80 grand's worth of dope on my lap." But Peter was unstoppable. He grabbed one of the bags and made off. Just then, the radio crackled into life. "Sparky, Sparky, are you there?" It was Mick using my call sign. "Zulu Tango, X-Ray Tango, receiving you loud and clear," I replied. Mick then asked me to give him the signal. I shouted for Peter to stay still and flashed the torch a couple of times. The radio crackled into life one last time. "Gotcha," Mick said. After a minute or so, I could hear the boat's engine, so I grabbed the bags. It turned out that Peter had left me with the 2 heavy ones and headed down to the water. I met Peter down by the sea, and we soon saw the silhouette of the boat come into view. We packed all the drugs in, and then Peter climbed on board. Mick turned to me, a big grin on his face. "Call Jack, tell him it's all gone to plan." But we're 20 minutes late. The boat had come so far into shore that it had virtually been grounded. I had to push it back into the sea, and the water was coming up to my chest. I pushed the boat as hard as I could, but it just couldn't seem to break free of the waves that were pushing it back to shore. Then suddenly, the propeller caught, and it shot off into the darkness. I was soaking wet, and walked slowly back to the car where I changed into my tracksuit bottoms and trainers. It was absolutely freezing, and so was the water, but I was so worked up from the adrenaline, I couldn't feel the cold at all. I was shaking, but it was all with excitement. All my fear and nerves had gone, and all I could think of was, fuck, I've done it. I've got away with it. I've got to admit, it was a great feeling. Blankenberg is just down the road from Ostend, but when I arrived there a little later that evening, I discovered I'd missed the last ferry. The next one wasn't until 7 AM, which meant I wouldn't get home until the middle of the afternoon. I didn't fancy that. I knew there was a ferry at 2:30 AM from Calais, and looking at the map, it didn't seem that far, so I decided to drive there. When I reached the French-Belgian border, I got pulled over by one of the guards and asked where I was going. They searched my car and found my wet clothes in the boot and asked what I'd been up to. I was feeling confident and cocky. After all, there was nothing at all to link me with any sort of drug smuggling. I had nothing to fear. I told the guard that I'd been playing around in the sea earlier that day and I'd missed the last ferry home from Ostend, so I decided to go back via Calais, so that I'd still be home the following morning. He looked a bit suspicious, but checked my passport, ran my name through the computer, and let me go. I got to Calais, and on my way to the boat, got pulled over by French customs. "Fucking hell," I said. "I've already been searched once tonight." The guy's face didn't even break a grin, let alone a smile. "Not by me, you haven't." He proceeded to give the car a really good going over, but of course, couldn't find anything, so he let me go on the boat. I tried to get to sleep on the ferry, but I couldn't because the crossing was so rough. Once we got to Dover, the only thing on my mind was getting back home and going to bed as quickly as possible. I drove the car off through customs, and as sod's law would have it, I got pulled over again. I was so tired, just so totally exhausted that I couldn't handle it. I freaked out. I was swearing, shouting, gone about the fact that I must have some sort of guilty sign stamped on my forehead, because I'd been pulled over twice already. In the end, I think they felt sorry for me. They just photocopied my passport and let me go home. The next day was even more exciting. Payday. I'd already been planning what I was going to spend the money on, and I was really looking forward to seeing those notes in my greedy little hands. I got there and told Mick I was there to pick up my wages. He went into the boot of his car and then laid a bar in my hands. "What the fuck's that?" I said. "It's a kilo of puff," he said. "Over here, that's worth 2,200. "That's your wages, apart from the 200 which you know owe me." F-U-C-K. This was not the way things were supposed to happen. One of the main reasons I wanted to get involved in the actual smuggling operation was so that I wouldn't have to sell drugs anymore, because it was such a pain in the arse lugging the stuff around town and then getting the money off people. But thanks to Mick, I was right back to where I started.